both countries are some of the biggest exporters of agricultural products in the world, because they have such large areas. So it's natural for the UK to import agricultural products from Canada and Australia. Now, you would have thought that then the UK would be then producing something else, and typically it would be things for which the UK has a relative advantage in terms of cost compared to Australia and Canada. And this would be the sort of the typical trade pattern about 60 to 70 years ago. And it still exists between many countries, but what's interesting in these slides 9 and 10 is that you will see that there's a lot of trade which is no longer intersectoral, that is, I import agricultural products, I export machines. There's a lot of trade, now more than half of the trade in the world between rich countries, which is intra-sectoral trade. That is, I export cars, but I also import cars. And that's why we need to spend quite a lot of time looking at theory to explain why on earth. I mean, we thought, and that's, I think, what you got in your first year when you looked a little bit at comparative advantage, we thought that it was all about specializing in the stuff which you're relatively good at. And now what you see is that you export and import exactly the same products. How can that be? So we need new theories to explain this sort of trade. So just to re-emphasize the point, look at the top exports of the British economy in the world. Mechanical machinery, electrical machinery, and so on. Cars, it's number 5. Now, imports. Number 1 and 2 are still there. You're importing. And cars are there, and so on. So as you can see, you're importing and exporting very So we need to try to make sense of this stuff. So just a little bit about these so-called regularities between trading partners. So it makes sense to think, to say that the size of an economy is going to be related, positively related to imports and exports. When it comes to exports, it's because when you are a big economy, you're going to be able to produce lots of stuff relatively well, so relatively low cost, and so you will be able to sell it to many other countries. On the other hand, because exporting in itself is really not the ultimate aim. The ultimate aim is to get income and then get utility from consumption. Because you export a lot, you will also be importing a lot, and so that's that's why you get that big economies such as the US, such as China, will have enormous trade values, both in terms of exports as well as in terms of imports. Now, distances, we saw with the example of Canada, Mexico versus other countries, does matter, and it matters because of at least these reasons. Now, transportation costs, you might think, well, surely this is not going to be crucial if you're transporting stuff such as gold that has such a high value, say, per kilo. Correct. There are plenty of other things that do not have that high value. And so the cost of transporting stuff 10,000 kilometers can be so high that trade is simply not going to take place between the two countries for that particular product. So the closer the countries are geographically, the more likely it is that there will be plenty of trade opportunities between the countries. But of course, distance also matters because trade happens between firms and people need to meet, and of course we have nowadays, with information technology, there's all sorts of virtual meetings we can have, but nothing really replaces actually seeing someone and seeing and getting a feeling for whether they are honest or not, and whether you can trade with them and so on. So despite all of these improvements in technology, there is still a lot of travelling out there, which happens because business people are trying to meet potential trading partners. Yeah. So just proximity, geographical proximity, just makes it a lot easier to do that. And of course, as should be obvious with the US and Canada, even though Canadians always stress, if you ever met a Canadian, you'll know that they're not Americans, and they're extremely proud of being Canadians and not being Americans. For someone such as a European, they do look a bit similar, and so there is quite a lot of cultural characteristics that are similar, and because they're similar, people will tend to have similar preferences, and that's why it makes a lot of sense to trade a lot, with these two countries, or between these two countries. So other factors, the cultural affinities, so language is obviously is something that should be obvious. You know, if you're exporting books and they're written in the English language, it's straightforward to export them to Australia and the US, much less so to export them to other countries. Many times you will be translating them. It's not quite the same thing. It's another product. It involves, it's going to involve more people, and it's extremely unlikely that you will be able to sell the same number of books as you did in the English-speaking countries. Geography, of course, is going to matter. So there is a lot of evidence that shows that one of the reasons why African countries can have a big disadvantage relative to many other countries in the world, it's because on average they're going to be big countries, not particularly densely populated, and many of them will be landlocked. And so, whereas Singapore, the UK, the US, and so on, they have these enormous, they have a very quick access to the sea. More than 80% of trade, it's still taking place via the oceans. Any landlocked country will have to spend a lot of money taking their products, that could be great, to the coast. And that is a big barrier to trade. Now, of course, as we saw a few days ago with the case of Saudi Arabia, trade is also influenced by political factors. So as you saw, by the way, from in those previous slides, Saudi Arabia is definitely not one of the biggest UK trading partners. So the cynics among you that think, oh, it's all because of the oil, well, clearly not. Because yes, they have a lot of oil, but most of the oil that Britain consumes actually doesn't come from Saudi Arabia at all. As a country, Britain, because of the North Sea oil, still produces a lot. But it has to do. But Saudi Arabia matters because of geopolitical reasons. You know, it's a big player in the Middle East, and of course, if you're going to want to be friends with a country, let's say Saudi Arabia, because of political reasons, there's always going to be an opportunity to sign some trade agreements and so on. So politics does matter when it comes to trade. And technological improvements here, this is just saying there are many things nowadays that are being traded and were not 50 years ago, 30 years ago. And the arrival of the internet and the World Wide Web has been absolutely crucial in this transformation. 50 years ago, we would say that most services would not be tradable goods. Yeah? So that sort of financial services produced in the city, they could not be exported. Why? Because you need proximity with people, and so they would have to be supplied in that country. Yeah? But now with the information technology, we export those sorts of things. So there's a lot of exporting financial services by the UK. Actually, the UK has a huge, as we know, a huge current account deficit and an even bigger deficit in the balance of goods. But the reason why it doesn't have a bigger current account deficit is because it has a big surplus in the balance of services. So the UK now exports a lot of services, including financial services, and that sort of, in part, compensates for the big deficit in the balance of goods. Yeah, but what this shows is that things that were not traded many decades ago are now being traded, and there is no reason to expect no changes in the future. So there will be products which, because of the prohibitively high transportation costs, are not being traded and are so-called non-tradable goods, so produced domestically, that will, because of better technology, eventually become tradable. Yeah? So the new opportunities for trade are always arise. Right, so this was basically just a introductory slides to try to motivate what next. The next two slides are just really giving you a flavour of what we're going to cover. So we're going to spend quite a lot of time looking at trade theory. So why is it that it takes place? We kind of hinted at two of the most important things. One is the idea that there's going to be an important element of comparative advantage. The other one is this idea that trade could take place between the same sectors, so there must be some sort of gain in becoming very good at producing a particular thing within a sector. And then we'll move on to trade policy. So there's going to be four big topics. The first one is what I'm going to start covering in a couple of minutes. So regarding trade theory, it's the oldest of the trade theories. It's still very, very relevant. So it focuses a lot on differences in productivity, and the comparative advantage comes from different relative productivities across sectors. Then we move on to another type of trade theory, which is called factor proportions theory, and that emphasizes that trade doesn't happen necessarily because there needs to be very different levels of productivity across sectors between the countries. The reason for trade is going to be related to differences in so-called resources or endowments. So when I gave you the example of Canada and Australia having this natural advantage in agricultural products, it's because they are, in our terminology, land abundant. So these are all relative terms. I'll come back to this. And then we move on to modern trade theory. And modern trade theory is the theory that explains why is it that the UK exports so many cars and also imports cars. It's no longer true that you are importing only the things that you're not producing internally. That's no longer the case. And we move on, and it's just one topic to talk about trade policy. You know, there's an enormous amount of interventions in trade. You have the WTO that is trying to obviously reduce barriers to trade across the world, but you have trade agreements, you have many, many interventions by governments in trades, and we want to dig a little bit deeper than this and try to explain why this happens, who gains and who loses from these things. Then we move on, and this is just one lecture, but I think it's a very important lecture. We move on to talk about trade and development. So I think all of you would agree that China would never have grown as fast as it had in the last 30 years without being open to trade. So what this has allowed China to do, of course, is to produce and sell a lot more than it could have if it hadn't relied only on domestic demand. However, there's still quite a lot of debate. So there's no question that growth